Part 3. Ownership. A Plea for Public Property. Roderick T. Long, 1998. Public or private? Libertarians often assume that a free society will be one in which all or nearly all property is private. I have previously expressed my dissent from this consensus, arguing that libertarian principles instead support a substantial role for public property. Footnote: In Defense of Public Space, Formulations 3.3, Spring 1996. In this article, I develop this heretical position further. Let me specify once again what sort of public property I am defending. To most people, public property means government property, on the dubious theory that governments hold their property in trust for the public and administer such property with an eye to the public interest. As an anarchist, I do not regard government as a legitimate institution, and so do not advocate government property of any sort. But this is not the only kind of public property. As I wrote in my earlier article, throughout history, legal doctrine has recognized, alongside property owned by the organized public, that is, the public as organized into a state and represented by government officials, an additional category of property owned by the unorganized public. This was property that the public at large was deemed to have a right of access to, but without any presumption that government would be involved in the matter at all. It is public property in this sense that I am defending. I want to stress, however, that in defending public property, I do not mean to be criticizing private property. I am a strong proponent of private property, but what I am maintaining is that the very features that make private property valuable are also possessed in certain contexts by public property, and so public property can be valuable for the same reasons. First, I shall consider three common libertarian arguments for private property, and I shall try to show that each of these arguments also supports a role for public property. Second, I shall consider several objections I have encountered to my position, and I shall attempt to meet them. The natural rights argument for private property. The standard libertarian natural rights argument for private property goes back to John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, and rests on two basic claims: a normative claim about how we should treat other people, and a descriptive claim about the boundaries of the person. The normative claim we may call the respect principle. This principle says that it is morally wrong to subject other people to one's own ends without their consent, except as a response to aggression by those others. There is disagreement as to what deeper moral truths, if any, provide the grounding for this principle, but that question lies beyond my present topic. The descriptive claim we may call the incorporation principle. This principle says that once I mix my labor with an external object, i.e. alter it so as to make it an instrument of my ongoing projects, that object becomes part of me. The case for this principle is that it explains why the matter I'm made of is part of me. After all, I wasn't born with it. Living organisms survive through constant replacement of material. The difference between an apple I eat, whose matter becomes part of my cellular composition, and a wooden branch that I carve into a spear, a detachable extension of my hand, is only one of degree. Footnote: For a fuller defense of this claim, see Samuel C. Wheeler III, Natural Property Rights as Body Rights. The Main Debate, Communism versus Capitalism, edited by Tibor R. Macan, New York Random 1987, pages 272 to 289. When we put the respect principle and the incorporation principle together, the result is that it is wrong to appropriate the products of other people's labor. For if your spear is a part of you, then I cannot subject your spear to my ends without thereby subjecting you to my ends. In the words of the 19th century French libertarians Leon Wolowski and Émile Levasseur, the producer has left a fragment of his own person in the thing which has thus become valuable, and may hence be regarded as a prolongation of the faculties of man acting upon external nature. As a free being, he belongs to himself. Now the cause, that is to say the productive force, is himself. The effect, that is to say the wealth produced, is still himself. Property, made manifest by labor, participates in the rights of the person whose emanation it is. Like him, it is inviolable so long as it does not extend so far as to come into collision with another right. Footnote: Quoted Murray N. Rothbard, for a New Liberty, The Libertarian Manifesto, Revised Edition, San Francisco, Fox, 1994, pages 36 to 37. The incorporation principle transforms the respect principle from a simple right to personal security into a general right to private property. How natural rights support public property too. But this Lockean argument for private property rights can be adapted to support public property rights as well. Lockeans hold that individuals have a property right to the products of their labor so long as they trespass on no one else's rights in producing them. They also typically hold that individuals have a property right to any goods that they receive by voluntary transfer from their legitimate owners, since to deny such a right would be to interfere with the right of the givers to dispose of their property as they choose. But the public at large can acquire property rights in both of these ways. To quote once more from In Defense of Public Space, consider a village near a lake. It is common for the villagers to walk down to the lake to go fishing. In the early days of the community, it's hard to get to the lake because of all the bushes and fallen branches in the way. But over time, the way is cleared and a path forms, not through any centrally coordinated effort, but simply as a result of all the individuals walking that way day after day. The cleared path is the product of labor, not any individual's labor, but all of them together. If one villager decided to take advantage of the now created path by setting up a gate and charging tolls, he would be violating the collective property right that the villagers together have earned. Public property can also be the product of gift. In 19th century England, it was common for roads to be built privately and then donated to the public for free use. This was not done out of altruism, but because the road builders owned land and businesses alongside the site of the new road, and they knew that having a road there would increase the value of their land and attract more customers to their businesses. Since collectives, like individuals, can mix their labor with unowned resources to make those resources more useful to their purposes, collectives too can claim property rights by homestead. And since collectives like individuals can be the beneficiaries of free voluntary transfer, collectives too can claim property rights by bequest. I should note one important difference between the homesteading case and the bequest case. In the homesteading case, it is presumably not the human race at large, but only the inhabitants of the village that acquire a collective property right in the cleared path, since it would be difficult for humankind as a whole, or even a substantial portion thereof, to mix its labor with a single resource, and so the homesteading argument places an upper limit on the size of property-owning collectives. But there seems to be no analogous limit to the size of the collective to which one can freely give one's property, so here the recipient might well be the human race as a whole. I have argued that the Lockean argument does not specify private property as the only justifiable option, but makes a place for public property as well. It should also be noted that in at least one case, the Lockean argument positively forbids private property, namely the case of intellectual property. This fact is not always recognized by Lockeans, but consider, suppose Proprius, a defender of protectionist legislation, were to invoke Lockean principles saying, well, surely private property is a good thing, right? So the market for widgets should be my private property. No one else should be allowed to enter that market without my permission. I demand a government-granted monopoly in widget production. No Lockean would take this argument seriously, for a market consists in the freely chosen interactions of individuals, so Proprius cannot own a market without owning people, and ownership of other people is forbidden by the respect principle. Suppose, however, that Proprius, our would-be monopolist, is also the inventor of the widget. Is his plea for exclusive control of the widget market now justified? Many Lockeans would think so, because we have a right to control the products of our labor, and if the product of Proprius's labor is the idea of the widget, then no one should be able to use or implement that idea without Proprius's permission. But the Lockean view is not that we come to own whatever we mix our labor with, rather we come to own whatever previously unowned item we mix our labor with. My plowing a field does not make it mine if the field was yours to begin with. Likewise, the fact that my labor is the causal origin of the widget idea in your mind may mean that in some sense I have mixed my labor with your mind, but it was your mind to begin with, so you, not I, am the legitimate owner of any improvements I make in it. For a fuller discussion, see my The Libertarian Case Against Intellectual Property Rights, Formulations, Volume 3, Number 1, Autumn 1995. The autonomy argument for private property. A somewhat different libertarian argument for private property focuses on the human need for autonomy, the ability to control one's own life without interference from others. Without private property, I have no place to stand that I can call my own. I have no protected sphere within which I can make decisions unhampered by the will of others. If autonomy in this sense is valuable, then we need private property for its realization and protection. How autonomy supports public property, too. It is true that private property provides a protected sphere of free decision-making for the property's owners, but what is the position of those who are not property owners, specifically those who do not own land? A system of exclusively private property certainly does not guarantee them a place to stand. If I am evicted from private plot A, where can I go except adjoining private plot B if there is no public highway or parkland connecting the various private spaces? If everywhere I can stand is a place where I have no right to stand without permission, then it seems I exist only by the sufferance of the lords of the earth, in Herbert Spencer's memorable phrase. Far from providing a sphere of independence, a society in which all property is private thus renders the propertyless completely dependent on those who own property. This strikes me as a dangerous situation, given the human propensity to abuse power when power is available. Footnote: this is a reason for my reservations about the proprietary community model for a free nation in which all land in the nation is held by a central agency and leased to its inhabitants. See The Return of Leviathan, Can We Prevent It? Formulations 3.3, Spring 1996. It may be argued in response that a libertarian society will be so economically prosperous that those who own no land will easily acquire sufficient resources either to purchase land or to guarantee favorable treatment from existing landowners. This is true enough in the long run if the society remains a genuinely libertarian one. But in the short run, while the landless are struggling to better their condition, the landowners might be able to exploit them in such a way as to turn the society into something other than a free nation. The rivalry argument for private property. For many libertarians, the most important argument for private property is what Garrett Hardin has labeled the tragedy of the commons, though the basic idea goes back to Aristotle. Most resources are rivalrous. That is to say, the use of the resource by one person diminishes the amount or the value of that resource for others. If a rivalrous resource is also public property, meaning that no member of the public may be excluded from its use, there will be no incentive to conserve or improve the resource. Why bother to sow what others may freely reap? On the contrary, the resource will be overused and swiftly exhausted, since the inability to exclude other users makes it risky to defer consumption. Why bother to save what others may freely spend? Hence, private property is needed in order to prevent depletion of resources. How rivalry supports public property, too. The rivalry argument is quite correct as far as it goes, but how far is that? First, let's notice that the argument only applies to goods that are in fact rivalrous. So once again, it doesn't apply to intellectual property. My use of the idea of the widget doesn't make it less available for others. Nor does it make others' widgets less valuable. On the contrary, the more widgets there are, the more uses for widgets are likely to be discovered or developed, and so the value of each widget increases. Ideas are public property in that no one may be legitimately excluded from their use. Another example of a largely non-rivalrous good is the Internet. I say largely non-rivalrous because the Internet does have a physical basis, which, though constantly expanding, is finite at any given time, and an increase in users can cause delays for everyone. But this rivalrous aspect is offset by the reverse effect. The value of the Internet to any one user increases as the volume of available information, potential correspondence, etc. increases, so additional users on balance increase the value of the good as a whole. It might be argued that this the more the merrier effect occurs only with goods that are wholly or largely non-physical but could never apply to more concrete resources like land. As Carol Rose and David Schmitz have shown, however, although any physical resource is finite and so inevitably has some tragedy of the commons aspects, many resources have comedy of the commons aspects as well, and in some cases the latter may outweigh the former, thus making public property more efficient than private property. Footnote: Carol Rose, The Comedy of the Commons, Custom, Commerce, and Inherently Public Property. University of Chicago Law Review, 53.3, Summer 1986, pages 711 to 781. David Schmitz, The Institution of Property, Social Philosophy and Policy, 11, 1994, pages 42 to 62. For instance, to adapt one of Carol Rose's examples, suppose that a public fair is a comedy of the commons good. The more people who participate, the better, within certain limits at any rate. Imagine two such fairs, one held on private property and the other on public. The private owner has an incentive to exclude all participants who do not pay him a certain fee, thus the fair is deprived of all the participants who cannot afford the fee. I am assuming that the purpose of the fair is primarily social rather than commercial, so that impecunious participants would bring as much value to the fair as wealthy ones. The fair held on public property will thus be more successful than the one held on private property. Yet it may be objected, so long as a comedy of the commons good still has some rivalrous tragedy of the commons aspects, it will be depleted, and thus the comedy of the commons benefits will be lost anyway. But this assumes that privatization is the only way to prevent overuse. In fact, however, most societies throughout history have had common areas whose users were successfully restrained by social mores, peer pressure, and the like. Objection 1. The coherence of public property. One common libertarian objection to public property, and particularly public ownership of land, is that the whole idea makes no sense. A resource cannot be collectively owned unless every part of the resource admits of simultaneous use by all members of the collective. This objection has been forcefully stated by Isabel Patterson. Two bodies cannot occupy the same place at the same time. 10 men may be legally equal owners of one field, but none of them can get any good of it unless its occupancy and use is allotted among them by measure of time and space. If all 10 wished to do exactly the same thing at the same time in the same spot, it would be physically impossible. Group ownership necessarily revolves into management by one person. Footnote: Isabel Patterson, The God of the Machine, New Brunswick, Transaction, 1993, pages 180 to 181. Patterson does, however, offer the following qualification to her claim that public property is inherently impossible. It is practicable, whether or not it is necessary or advisable, to make roads public property, because the use of a road is to traverse it. Though the user does in fact occupy a given space at a given moment, the duration is negligible, so that there is no need to take time and space into account except by negation, a prohibition. The passenger is not allowed to remain as of right indefinitely on any one spot in the road. The same rule applies to parks and public buildings. The arrangement is sufficiently practicable in those conditions to admit the fiction of public ownership. To be sure, even in the use of a road, if too many members of the public try to move along it at once, the rule reverts to first come, first served, allotment in time and space, or the authorities may close the road. The public has not the essential property right of continuous and final occupancy. Public property then admits of use by the public only in transit, not for production, exchange, consumption, or for security as standing ground. Footnote: Patterson, pages 181 to 182. Note that here, Patterson actually points out 3 ways in which public property can be feasible. First, it may be the case that not enough people are competing for the use of the same portion of the property to cause a conflict. Patterson assumes this will only happen in cases where one user's occupancy of a given area is of minimal duration, but clearly the same result could be achieved when the total volume of users is low enough, and the resource itself is homogeneous enough that a lengthier occupancy of any particular portion of the resource is no inconvenience to anyone else. Second and third, in cases where use is becoming rivalrous, Patterson offers 2 possible solutions. One solution is to require frequent turnover so that no one member of the public is allowed to monopolize any portion of the resource for longer than a certain time period. The other solution is to adopt first come, first served, meaning that those who currently occupy portions of the property may stay there and exclude newcomers. Patterson thinks that both of these options take away from the genuinely public nature of the property. But do they? According to Patterson, the turnover requirement takes away from the publicness of the property because the public then lacks the essential property right of continuous and final occupancy. But is this true? If no individual member of the public has the essential property right of continuous and final occupancy, it hardly follows that the public as such lacks this right. In fact, the turnover requirement is precisely a means of implementing that right. What about the first come, first served rule? Patterson may think that this ends the publicness of the property because it gives individuals the right to exclude others from the particular portions they have claimed. But this falls short of a full private property right. If I have private ownership of a portion of land, then that land remains mine, off limits to others, even when I am away from the land. But if I leave the particular area of a public park that I've been squatting in, I lose all rights to it. In that respect, what I have a right to is more like a place in line than it is like freehold property. Which is preferable, the turnover rule or the first come, first served rule? Presumably, it depends on the function of the resource in question. In the case of a road, it is in the interest of the owners, the public, that the turnover rule be applied because a road loses its usefulness if it cannot be traversed. However, the autonomy argument suggests that not all public property should be subject to the turnover rule, so in some cases the first come, first served rule is appropriate. Suppose a conflict arises between two users of the property, one who thinks it should be governed by the turnover rule, and another who thinks it should be governed by the first come, first served rule. What happens? Well, ideally the distinction should be made by the owner, the public, but only a unanimous decision could count as the will of the public, and unanimous decisions are hard to come by. Putting the matter to a vote would reveal only the will of a majority faction of the public. In that case, the public is in the same situation as an infant, a lunatic, a missing person, or a person in a coma. The public has the right to decide the matter, but is currently incapable of making a coherent decision, and so the decision must be made for them by a court which attempts, presumably in response to a class action suit, to determine what is in the best interest of the rights holder. Objection 2. Policing public property. As Rich Hammer is fond of pointing out, shopping malls are generally safer than city streets. As Rich notes, this is so for two reasons. First, the owners of the malls have a financial incentive to police their premises so as to avoid losing customers, while government police face much weaker incentives. Second, mall owners can set higher standards for what is permissible behavior on their premises and can exclude undesirable persons more or less at will, while the police have less power to kick people off the city streets. Does this mean that public property in a libertarian society will be under-policed? Not necessarily. Consider the incentive issue first. Since the property is public, everyone has an equal right to police it, but some will have stronger motives for policing than others. Consider the case mentioned earlier of the road built for and donated to the public by those who owned property alongside the road and hoped the road's proximity would raise their property values and bring increased traffic to their businesses. The same incentives that led the owners to build this road would also lead them to police it, since property values will be higher and customers will be more plentiful if the road is safe. Moreover, the unsafeness of city streets results not only from the fact that they are public, but from the fact that the police enjoy a monopoly on protection services. A competitive market in security would probably find some way to offer its customers protection while on public property. For example, public parks might be patrolled by a consortium of insurance companies if a substantial number of their customers enjoy visiting public parks. As for the higher standards issue, it is true that users of public property face a somewhat greater risk from their fellow users than users of private property do. A private mall, particularly in a libertarian society where the right to control access to one's private property is legally protected, can exclude users who simply appear to pose a threat to other users, even if they have committed no overt act, or can admit them only if they post a bond, disarm themselves, show proof of insurance or a letter from their pastor, etc. Public property, by contrast, must be open to anyone whose conduct so far is peaceful. By the same token, however, public property allows more freedom. That is why the best option is a society that makes room for both public and private property. Those who place a high value on security and are willing to put up with some burdensome restrictions in order to get it, call them the little old ladies, will be free to patronize private property, while those who seek self-expression, are averse to restrictions, and are willing to put up with more risk from others, call them the gun-toting, pot-smoking, nudist bikers, will likewise be free to patronize public property. Objection 3. Liability in public property. In a free society, people are liable for harm that they cause. Now, suppose I own the road that runs past your house, and I decide to donate that road to the general public. Now it is no longer possible to exclude undesirables from the road. There used to be guards at the toll gate who checked drivers' IDs, but now they are gone, and one day some loony who in the old days would have been excluded takes the public road to your house and massacres your family. Since the loss to your security was caused by my decision, it has been suggested to me by Rich Hammer that I should be legally liable for the result. And if this is so, then public property would not be tolerated in a free nation, because the liability costs would simply be too high. But surely a libertarian legal system will not hold people liable for every harm to which they merely made a causal contribution. The current statist trend of holding gun manufacturers liable for the use of guns by criminals and so forth flies in the face of the libertarian principle of personal responsibility. An owner is not obligated to check out the background of everyone he gives or sells property to. Objection 4. Reversion of public property. Once property becomes public, how can it ever become private again? In a free market economy, property tends to be assigned to its highest valued use, because those who value the property more will purchase it from those who value it less. But if I value Central Park more than the public at large does, how do I go about purchasing it from the public? The dispersed, disorganized, and divided public lacks the ability to consent to the sale. This is a difficult problem to which I do not have a full solution, but let me try out a few possibilities. There are two ways I can lose my claim to property. I can give or sell it, or I can abandon it. The public is not in a position to give or sell its property, but perhaps it is capable of abandoning it. Footnote. At least, I don't think so. Someone could argue that the court could act on behalf of the people's interests, authorizing the transfer of ownership from the collective to me in exchange for the price of my doing something judged to be of general benefit to the public. But I am wary of heading too far down that path. For one thing, if the court acquires too much power to administer the property of the disorganized public, we start to move back toward the organized public model of government property, and the whole idea of free access is replaced by access in the interests of the public as determined by some official. For another, the value of public property is severely undermined if it can be unpredictably privatized on some judge's say-so. What counts as the public's having abandoned a piece of property? Well, the easiest case would be if no one has used it for a very long time. How long? Well, the length of time should presumably be the same as whatever is accepted in the case of abandoning private property. But what if only a few people have used it? Does that count as the public's using it, given that the property has never been used by the entire public? Or suppose I privatize some portion of the property, claiming it for my own use, fencing it in, and so forth. Perhaps it then counts as mine so long as no one protests. How widely do I have to advertise the fact that I've done this? But again, what if just a few people protest? Does that count? Ultimately, these problems will have to be resolved by a libertarian legal system through evolving common law precedents. That's fine with me. What I would want to insist on, though, is that some role for public property is important for a libertarian society. An all-private system can be oppressive, just as an all-public one can be, but a system that allows networks of private spaces and public spaces to compete against each other offers the greatest scope for individual freedom. From Whence Do Property Titles Arise? William Gillis, 2009. Many market theorists take property titles as axiomatic and then develop coercive apparatuses to enforce them, justifying such coercion by appealing to notions like implicit consent and or the justness of contracts that sell off part of one's agency in the future. This rightfully bugs the crap out of many anarcho-communists. Left-market theorists, in turn, tend to write off these apprehensions as a contention over differing ideal systems of property, i.e., differences over what constitutes abandonment and the general viability of collective property. But this, as I've argued time and time again, is a profoundly limited understanding of the criticisms being lobbed against them. First off, not every system of mediating between different people's desires or uses for objects is describable in terms of property titles. Property titles are claims by discrete agents to absolute veto power over the use of an object. They're a construct used for negotiating between the justness of uses by individuals with competing intentions for an object. Property titles solve the problem by determining whether A or B then gets to personally make the decision between direction 1 or 2 for a given object. But this clearly isn't the only way to approach such situations. When anarcho-communists talk of societies without the concept of property, they often mean a social system where decisions over how to use any specific object or resource are never limited to a discrete body of select individuals, but are rather discussions open to anyone and everyone with a stake, desire, or idea to contribute. There, the critical economic entities are directions rather than veto titles, concepts rather than individuals. The mediation processes possible can be incredibly complex and dynamic. So, on a protozoic level, you might have a simple discussion or unchallenged focus. I specialize in the use of a single toothbrush, and consequently, given that toothbrush's historical context, not many people are going to have a more useful proposal for its use. While aggregate systems of more advanced mechanisms are visible in the open-source development. In short, where the most scarce resource is personal time and the weight of one's voice is the nearest thing to currency. At the same time, there are often scarcities in space, functionally identical to material, for widely varying projects, and in response entire ecosystems of discussion open up. It's worth noting that under many systems of property titles, if the legal experts cannot reach consensus on who is the legitimate owner of an object, nothing is done with the object in the meantime. Those involved in contending differing uses for an object in a propertyless society are directly capable of far more diverse means of negotiation, but so too, if they can't reach consensus, then nothing is done with the object, because literally everyone in the world has the capacity to veto. To some, this might appear, while a philosophically coherent counterproposal to property, and even briefly workable on a small level, completely batshit insane. And maybe so, but in practice, such external-to-property approaches are often workable enough. The lone immature interjecting troublemaker, or any other conceivable exploit of consensus, simply doesn't exist after a few social iterations because everyone is dependent upon everyone else, no matter how distant a community they come from, and thus it's in their interest to maintain, develop, and convey goodwill. Obviously, however, just because such differing economic approaches might make better software for a fraction of the energy Microsoft spends, doesn't mean that it can do things like move goods between locations to satisfy demand efficiently or signal all of the costs of one consumption versus another. Without the capacity to assign value to spatial physical relationships, as with the realm of actors and objects, one can't coherently mediate between those relationships. And whatever the dominant dilemmas might be in primitive cultures of plenty or post-human hives of nanobots, it shouldn't be particularly controversial to assert that the placement of material objects is the central calculational problem in the world today. Some form of property titles seems called for, however sticky, however collectively or individually managed. The point is, that's a debate over fitness. While it may be undesirable, it remains entirely possible to construct a society outside of property altogether. Following the popular slogan, everything for everyone, the stubborn market theorist might still proclaim that such a society would still count as a system with property title expanded to everyone. While practically meaningless, this wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but as a theoretical framework in such instance, property titles would be missing the point. No one in that society would think in anything approaching such terms. Which leads us to a second critique of property. It's not hard to come to the conclusion that the very adoption of property titles in our minds leads toward a worldview of increasing compartmentalization and taxonomy. Indeed, this is a popular assumption. By progressively chopping up the world around us, the notion goes, we become inclined to view the world solely as a tally sheet of ownership. Forgive the digression to my 90s Nickelodeon childhood, but in illustration I am reminded of an episode of Angry Beavers in which the brothers suddenly discover that they each have a musk pouch capable of marking items with a colored personal stench that repels everyone but themselves. This quickly sets off a war of personal claim until the entire world is divvied up with one stench or the other, each brother more and more compulsively obsessed with the tally until they can think of nothing else. This is perhaps the most classic criticism of capitalism, one of simple psychology, and yet it seems to be a critique market theorists are incapable of parsing. To many an anti-capitalist, the problem with the capitalist framework is its inherent bent toward materialism, ultimately to the point of treating human beings as objects. But this is incomprehensible for libertarians because they see respect for property titles as entirely stemming from a respect for personal agency. In practical, everyday terms, respect for another person's agency often comes down to a respect for the inviolability of their body. Do not shoot them, do not rape them, do not torture them. Because humans are tool-using creatures like hermit crabs, there is often no clear line between our biomass and our possessions. We use clothes instead of fur, retain dead mass excreted as hair follicles, etc. And so a respect for another's person seems to extend in some ways to a respect for things that they use. Begin to talk of rights, and these associations must be drawn more absolutely. And sure enough, we already have a common-sense prescription, often enforced in absolutist terms, that matches this intuition. Do not steal. Yet the anti-capitalists are clearly on to something. Even setting aside the evolutionary cognitive biases of Homo sapiens, we as individuals have limited processing. We can't think everything at the same time. If some of the thought processes necessary to succeed and flourish under a given system run out of control and take up more and more space, others, like those behind why we adopted that system in the first place, will get pushed to the periphery. If a certain metric is set as the alpha and omega of a society, whether it be the acquisition of a specific universal currency or simply aggregate atoms, its status as the requirement or key to any pursuit or desire can end up having an effect upon those pursuits and desires. Anti-capitalists often disingenuously blur the distinction between wealth and coercive power. Wealth and or disequilibria in wealth do not inherently have to grant any capacity for social control, but it's certainly true that direct pursuits of power and wealth share the same form. Single-mindedness is progressively rewarded until the inertia of this approach crowds out of mind the reason we originally assigned value to wealth or power. Consequently, rather than focus on accumulating property titles or money as a gateway to opportunity, anarcho-communists argue we should focus on accumulating goodwill. I don't disagree. But once you characterize this focus on goodwill in market terms, a la something similar to Doctorow's reputation markets, the path out of all these tangles becomes apparent. It seems pretty damn clear that property titles are a tool with incredible utility in the world as it exists today and the technical challenges we face. As such, it stands to reason that those within a goodwill-focused anarcho-communist society stand a comparative advantage to negotiate and adopt a second-order system for developing and recognizing property titles. Regardless of precisely how their market ends up dynamically meeting this, goodwill would remain the primary good capable of being turned into, among other things, selective veto use titles to physical objects. As such, we can clear the psychological hurdle. Without a state-coerced enforcement system underpinning property titles or centralized banks and currency, property titles are not as stable or universally applicable an investment as goodwill. And goodwill, as opposed to property titles, is directly methodologically tied to appreciating and respecting people as agents. Footnote: there is a point to be made here about the problem of manipulation, but I think it's a much broader point that no structural system can address directly because on such a level we can't dictate intent, we can only recognize and work around biases. So it's no more a functional problem than it is for anarcho-communism. That said, I think intent and psychological issues of control are rightfully at the very core of the anarchist project. It just falls outside the purview of this discussion. This suggests a way to tackle fringe conditions in ownership. Rothbard readily recognized, for instance, that a world in which one man held title to everything would clearly be indiscernible from tyranny. Expand the number of owners and you'd still have an oligarchy. Even granting a token amount of wealth to the rest of the populace wouldn't necessarily jumpstart the market and allow it to drift back in a more dynamic and egalitarian direction, because said wealth may simply be insufficient as capital. However, if property is a second-order good derived from market institutions based in reputation, goodwill, and credit, then if one class systematically fucked over their credit with all of another class, the underclass would no longer have any incentive to respect their title claims, because no individual within it would fear even marginal sanction or loss of goodwill for occupying and appropriating their wealth. Simply put, if before anyone else can do anything on a new colony, I create robots to till the entire surface of the planet, that doesn't inherently create an incentive among the rest of the colonists to respect a veto use claim on my part to the entire planet. If others admire and derive value from my mass-tilling project or from the potential products of it, then my voice is more likely to be respected in discussion over its uses. But if I want to obtain acceptance of a veto use claim, it would have to derive from others' desire of social conditions of respect conducive to undertaking their own projects and having their own stuff respected. One gravitates toward adopting property titles because, through their exchange, one can much further maximize the satiation of one's desires, agreeing to butt the hell out of other people's decisions when it comes to the use of certain objects, in exchange for them butting the hell out of your decisions with other objects. Accepting my ownership of literally everything would make that impossible. Not only does this cope with such boundary conditions, but it also addresses old Marxist paranoia about the runaway accumulation of wealth through usury. Viewed in the light of a reputation market, Jeremy Whalen's old point is even more apt. Without the state, the more wealth you control, the more ridiculously you stand to risk having to pay through the nose to secure against theft and betrayal from those you're paying. It's easier to steal $1 million from the bank or a vault than to rob 1,000 or so common people. It may be that in a free market, there will exist a natural mean personal wealth value, beyond which diminishing returns enter quickly, and below which one is extremely disposed toward profit and enrichment. It's a distinction between information and objects. Ultimately, you can't steal good credit. People's trust, goodwill, and their whole panorama of intention toward you exists within them internally. It's accessible by anyone anywhere, but they're the only ones capable of changing it. There are no banks that it can be kept within, only distributed collective or institutional relay points through which it can be conveyed, and trust critically underlies all material transactions. Incidentally, this renders the entire debate over proposed systematic prohibitions of wages, rent, and interest moot. Obviously, all will be, in some contexts, however fringe, desirably or neutrally regarded by all parties. But even if they crop up as large phenomena, that's not reason to panic, flip the fuck out, and organize shit like armed roving homesteaders with ideologically precise definitions of legitimate property. Instead, the market will already be ready to grind down or impede any vast swaths of accumulated wealth, because it will be the market that negotiates the acceptance of said wealth. Not necessarily through malicious crime, but through higher-level market mechanisms that ultimately give rise to the extent and strength of the claim. As a market, it might not look much like the idealized American myth of our simplistic contemporary market. But then again, we knew it wouldn't. The Gift Economy of Property. Shawn Wilbur, 2008. I think most anarchists and libertarians share a faith that it is possible for needs to be met, goods to be distributed, and some level of general prosperity achieved in a way that is voluntary and at least approximately just. But we couldn't differ more, it seems, when we start to ask how to get the work done. Probably most of us aim in the long run for a society where there is sufficient prosperity that we could be much less concerned about such things, where generosity would be a logical response to plenty. But we live in the midst of a society and economic system which is very far from that ideal, and dream our dreams of the future and freedom while we deal with a very unfree present. On a day when we've just witnessed the largest U.S. bank failure in history, in the context of a government-brokered market move by J.P. Morgan, who also benefited from the Bear Stearns maneuver, Talk about genuinely free markets seems a bit pipe-dreamy. But if it's going to be a long struggle to whatever freedom we manage to wrest from the corrupt bastards who are currently monkeying with our lives, we can probably take the time to get on something like the same page. Recently, I've been presenting some of Proudhon's ideas about individuality and free will, as well as reviewing his work on property. Footnote: see Shawn Wilbur, Proudhon on Freedom and Free Will, Two-Gun Mutualism and the Golden Rule, No Publisher, September 12, 2008, libertarian-labyrinth.blogspot.com, March 13, 2011. I have begun to suggest some of the ways in which the early critique of property as a despotic, absolutist principle became the basis for Proudhon's later reluctant propertarianism, which he based on his analysis of the human self, the moi, which he found was itself naturally absolutist and despotic when given a chance. Like Fourier, Proudhon could not accept any notion of original sin, in part because, like Fourier, he associated present errors with a progressive process that led ultimately to closer and closer approximations to justice, the Pact of Liberty, through equilibration of forces, faculties, projects, parties, federations, etc. Having had done with the divine absolute, he could only depend on human ethical actors themselves to accomplish the march towards justice, the justification of their institutions, the perfection of their concepts, etc. But it was obvious to him that they would never do it alone. Absolutism and despotism, if allowed entirely free play, are unlikely to lead to any pact, let alone a just one. No social atomist, however, and a thinker prone to expect every force to evoke a counterforce, he wasn't content to turn that absolutist character into a secular version of innate depravity. What he did do is a bit peculiar, involving a hijacking of Leibniz in directions that anticipate folks like Gilles Deleuze. The psychological and social physics that is at the center of his mature work on liberty and justice reads like post-structuralism in places, and I will have some recourse to the vocabulary of more contemporary continental philosophy as I talk about it. If the self is not innately depraved, neither is it simple, centered, clean, and proper. Anybody or being, Proudhon says, possesses a quantity of collective force derived from the organization of its component parts. Though these component parts may be subject to rigid determination, the resultant force exceeds the power of the parts, and, to the extent that the collective force is great and the organization that it rises from is complex, it escapes any particular constituent destiny. The collective force is the quantity of liberty possessed by the being. Freedom is thus a product of necessity and expresses itself, at the next level, as a new sort of necessity. And perhaps at most levels of Proudhon's analysis, and we can move up and down the scale of beings, from the simplest levels of organization up to complex societal groupings, and perhaps to organization on even larger scales, the quantity of liberty introduced wouldn't look much like the individual freedom that we value. But the human free absolute, distinguished by the ability to say moi and to reflect on her position in this scheme, has her absolutism tempered by its encounters with its fellows, also free absolutes, also pursuing a line drawn by the play of liberty and necessity. Out of their encounters, out of mutual recognition, the pact of liberty arises, or fails to arise, where lack of recognition or misrecognition takes place, and a collective reason, possessed, in social organs and institutions, in common sense, etc., by a higher order being, which is to say a higher order, but latent rather than free, because it lacks that ability to say moi, absolute. In the system that emerges around these notions, individual human beings hold a very special place as the chief architects and artisans of justice. Again, like Fourier, Proudhon makes a point of not stigmatizing the impulses of individuals, and far more than Fourier, he actually makes a virtue of individual egoism and absolutism, as long as we are not so self-absorbed that we can't recognize our fellow egoists and absolutists as such. Even the higher wisdom that is possessed by the higher order collective beings, like society and the state, which in his latter works takes on a very different meaning than anarchists generally give it, is really in large part in the hands of human individuals. Necessity gives rise to liberty, which tends to a kind of necessity. Individualism, even complete insolidarity, tends, as we have seen elsewhere in Proudhon's work, to centralization, to the dangerous socialism that Leroux warned against in 1834, but also, if equilibrium can be maintained, to an expanded space of social freedom, the liberty of the social being, for the individual. It's all a little dizzying, and in the middle of it, star of the show, sits the individual self, the moi, which, while off the hook for original sin, still has to deal with something we might think of as original impropriety. What can the man who never backed down about property being robbery say about this self, which is, whatever else it is, a kind of byproduct of the forces of necessity that tends, according to him, to see itself as an absolute? What can that self say about its own position? Proudhon suggests that we have put off a certain amount of soul-searching by projecting our own absolutism outwards, onto gods and onto governments, but that this has kept us from dealing with some important stuff, and we're not fooling ourselves much anymore. If progress, as Proudhon believed, is the justification of humanity by itself, one of the spurs for that progress has to be, for us free absolutes, an internal tension, maybe even a suspicion that the absolutism of the individual is not so different from that of the proprietor, and for many of the same reasons. Property might be as impossible in the psychological realm as Proudhon believed it was in the economic. We are talking about a de-centered subject that claims more identity than might be precisely justified. I have often joked that Derrida's claims about identity might be reduced to property is theft. But we're not talking about lack. Instead, we're talking about the self as a kind of excess, a force or pressure. It would be very easy to move here from Proudhon to, say, Georges Bataille, and certainly easy to compare either or both to the anarchistic ethics of Gillis. We are not committing ourselves to some social organism theory. Proudhon is explicit about this. And again, we might reach without much straining for points of contact with the thoughts of Deleuze on organization, etc. If we switch to the language of libertarianism, we're likely to find that Proudhon's vision of overlapping beings, and of human free absolutes as the foam at the top of the boiling pot of necessity, at least complicates the question of self-ownership. Some of my friends will naturally object to this claim, and I'm sympathetic to the basic assumptions associated with a presumed right of self-ownership. Indeed, as Proudhon said, my principle, which will appear astonishing to you citizens, my principle is yours. It is property itself. But it does seem to me that if the self is characterized by a radical, unresolvable antinomy, then property cannot, by itself, express the natural right implied by the nature of the individual. Like Proudhon, I suspect that property is theft, and following his thread, I suspect that self-ownership is an expression of our absolutism. Still, like Proudhon, in the end I am for property, or at least the right to it, which leaves the questions how and why. Aren't there alternatives? It seems to me that the search for alternatives to property, the right to control the fruits of one's labor, is, like the general resistance to the notion of markets in anarchism, based in our quite natural frustration and disgust with so much of what passes for commerce under current conditions. We are in the middle of far too fine an example of how despotic poverty can be when married to governmental power and shielded from any countervailing force, to have many illusions about the risks involved in embracing it. Mutualists in particular never quite get off this hook. Our greatest hit, Proudhon's What is Property, or its most famous slogan, is a constant reminder. It is commonplace in social anarchist circles, and mutualists are not immune, to want to distance ourselves from the details of getting and spending as much as possible, and we have constructed a variety of means of putting off the hard discussions of property relations that will eventually inevitably come. One of these means, it seems to me, has been reference to the notion of gift economies. Like the proponents of the right to self-ownership, the advocates of gift economies have meant quite a variety of things by the term. In general, gift economies are differentiated from exchange economies precisely by the lack of exchanges, expectation of any remuneration, or quid pro quo. Some institutionalized forms of gift exchange, like the really free markets, forbid even barter. While it's clear enough to me what present desires are addressed by this alternative to capitalist commerce, this seems to be one of those practices that could always only operate on the edges of another, more organized and efficient kind of economy. That economy might well be freer in some senses than the enforced gift economy, and it is not entirely clear to me that what is involved in that economy is gifting anyway. In order to give, it is necessary to be free to give. One cannot be, in some sense at least, an owner of the gift, and the recipient cannot have an equal claim to appropriating the item. Collective property cannot be gifted within the collective, at least without changing rather substantially the meaning of giving. Philosophical and anthropological accounts of the gift set all sorts of other conditions. The recipient of a gift may be required by custom or by the spirit of the gift to some giving of his own. Gifts are notorious for the poison elements that they often contain. Some of the gift economies we know from anthropology did operate without recompense in goods, but transformed material capital into prestige or cultural capital, sometimes in an extremely competitive manner. The philosophical accounts of the gift suggest that the pure gift is almost impossibly tied up in conflicting requirements. If one acknowledges a gift, accepts thanks in exchange for a gift, perhaps even if one knows one is giving and feels some internal compensation, then the pure gift is impossible. Gifts seem, in any event, to matter. Something other than indifference is required from us, and gaining punk points may not be it. Disposing of our excess stuff may just not reach the bar. The gift economy seems to presuppose individual property as much as it would like to subvert its absolutism, its covetous tit-for-tat mentality. Is the gift perhaps related to the other half of our human antimony? What if it was? What, much too quickly, as I've gone on much too long, if the gift was indeed the mark of our other half? As our absolutism is necessity expressing itself in us, gratuity might well be the expression of liberty, of freedom. Perhaps property, understood as Proudhon understood it, as a bulwark around the individual in the face of centralizing, collectivizing forces, which, lest we forget, have their role to play in the march to justice and the expansion of liberty, starting with self-ownership, is the right implied by our basic human predicament, our in-progress nature, our need for space in which to experiment, advance. Would such a property be compatible with a gift economy? Or does Proudhon finally leave us in a place where neither property, strictly speaking, nor the gift, ditto, can arise? My intuition, based in part on some language in various places in Proudhon's work, and in part on the connections I've been making to other continental thought, is that a gift economy, in the sense of a system in which something which can be rightfully given is given with no specific expectations of return, could only arise in fairly limited circumstances, and perhaps can only have one application within Proudhon's thought, but that one application may be a bit of a doozy. We know that there is, for Proudhon, some opening for society to emerge as a pact of liberty leading towards approximations of equality and finally of justice. We know that freedom rises from the interplay of necessity and liberty, and that property too has its internal contradictions. Proudhon's moi has very little that he can rightfully give, if even his own property is theft. But he can, perhaps, give property to the other through recognition, which steals nothing, robs no one, and is perfectly gratuitous, even if, and this is the character of the gift economy, he cannot be sure of reciprocation. To the extent, however, that commerce is based in equal recognition, if not necessarily any other sort of equality, then this particular gift economy might be strangely, given all we have said and some of the names we have invoked, foundational. My social anarchist friends may object to this yoking of absolutism and gratuity in, of all things, property. My libertarian friends will doubtless wince a bit at the notion that self-ownership is a gift as opposed to a given, but I think there is at least food for thought here. Fairness and Possession. Gary Chartier, 2011. Justice in possession is not per se a matter of relationships between people and things. Rather, it's a matter of relationships among people. Like many, perhaps not all, moral requirements, it has to do with how it's reasonable for us to treat each other. The basic moral requirement of fairness means that we have good reason to take each other's interests into account when we make decisions. In tandem with a set of truisms about human behavior and the human condition, this principle entails respect for a set of rules about possession. There is good reason for a just legal system to treat these rules as exceptionless, though somewhat less reason for individual moral actors to do so. We can fail to be reasonable in relation to each other in various ways. For instance, I can opt to attack some aspect of your well-being out of spite or a desire for revenge, or as a means to accomplishing some goal of mine. And this kind of unreasonableness is extremely important. It's at the root of much injustice in war, for instance. But it's not the kind of unreasonableness that typically arises when people ignore or actively violate each other's legitimate possessory interests. Generally, the kind of unreasonable action at issue in such cases is arbitrary discrimination among those affected by an agent's choices. This kind of unreasonableness violates what I'll call the principle of fairness. There are different ways to express this principle, none immune to criticism. For present purposes, I want to highlight a fairly simple aspect of the principle, which can be formulated something like this. Avoid treating others in ways you wouldn't be willing to be treated in relevantly similar circumstances. This formulation is rooted in what I take to be the intuitively plausible suggestion that those affected by our acts and omissions are generally quite like ourselves, and that simple numerical difference is insufficient to warrant fundamentally different treatment. This aspect of the principle of fairness can serve as the basis of a set of possessory rules. First, the principle establishes a presumption in favor of allowing people to retain control of the things they actually possess. Most of us aren't willing most of the time for others violently or deceptively to snatch our stuff, so it's generally not reasonable for us to take theirs. Of course, that basic presumption can be defeated, as the notion of objectionable snatching itself suggests. Thieves don't like their possessions taken any more than do those who come by what they have honestly and peacefully, but our reaction to thieves' possessory claims tend, I think justifiably, to be rather different from our responses to the claims of those the thieves have dispossessed. Further considerations help to clarify the reach and narrow the range of just possessory rules. Taken in tandem with the principle of fairness, these considerations provide considerable support for what I call the baseline rules. 1. Someone establishes a just possessory claim to an unclaimed physical object or tract of land by establishment of effective possession of it. 2. Once a person takes possession of a physical object or tract of land, it's up to her how it's used and what is done with it, to the extent that, in so doing, she doesn't attack other people's bodies or justly acquired possessions. 3. This means, in particular, that someone with a just possessory claim freely permits someone else to take possession of an object or tract of land that is hers on any mutually agreeable terms. If I'm right about the baseline rules, then, while it will be true in some sense that possessory norms are conventions, they are tightly constrained conventions, since fairness seems to require that reasonable possessory norms incorporate the baseline rules. A look at some relevant considerations will help to make clear how they support the baseline rules. Accessibility. All other things being equal, presuming in particular that costs can't be shifted onto the unwilling, as so often happens in connection with abuses ranging from slavery to pollution, everyone benefits as supplies of the goods and services people want increases and their costs decrease. If people's possessory rights are stable so that they can bargain with others and keep what they are promised in return for goods and services they provide, they are more likely to produce those goods and services in desirable quantities at desirable prices. Autonomy. People tend to want autonomy. They want to be able to make their own decisions without, at minimum, forcible interference from others. Stable possessory claims enable people to preserve their autonomy, so it will be unreasonable for most people not to favor rules that protect such claims. Coordination. Coordinating the behavior of economic actors, setting prices and determining production levels and distribution patterns can be a rational activity only if people have stable possessory rights. Compensation. Stable possessory rights enable people to bargain effectively with each other. Such rights create a baseline for bargaining and make people more likely to be compensated for their past efforts. Generosity. You can't be generous if you don't have stable possessory rights, and those to whom you give lack such rights. Incentivization. People are likely to be productive, in ways that benefit themselves and others alike, when they can keep what they earn. This means, in turn, that they and those with whom they bargain need stable possessory rights. Peacemaking. Stable possessory rights, acknowledged as such by everyone, reduce conflict over scarce resources. Productivity. Having stable possessory rights means that people are likely to put resources to their most productive use. This point needs some qualifying, of course, since different people have different goals. One person's goal for a piece of land, for instance, may be precisely that it function effectively as a nature preserve. Reliability. Reliability makes for stable and effective planning. Simplicity. Simple rules are easier to formulate, articulate, understand, and apply. The baseline rules are simpler than almost all alternatives. They are less so, perhaps, than a set of rules allowing everyone access to everything, but the other considerations certainly suggest that such rules would be undesirable. Stability. Some rules are likely to be rooted in self-enforcing conventions. Such rules are easier to understand and apply, and there is good reason to think that the baseline rules are precisely stable, self-enforcing conventions. Stewardship. Stewardship matters. Everyone benefits when things are well taken care of, and things are well taken care of when someone in particular is responsible for everything. These various considerations contribute to overlapping latticeworks of justification for the baseline possessory rules. In general, all of them, concern for the productivity of individual assets is arguably the one exception, tilt in the same direction. To treat others fairly, to take their interests appropriately into account, is to act in a way that takes each of these considerations seriously. The principle of fairness will require compensation for violations of interests protected by the baseline rules. After all, the rules are pretty meaningless if they can be violated with impunity. Legitimate interests deserve protection. Those considering the possibility of causing harm to others' possessions are best situated to avoid or prevent the harms they're considering causing. Further, fairness suggests that they should not shift the costs of compensating their victims to others. And a compensation requirement will obviously serve to incentivize those who might cause harm to avoid doing so. Exceptionless rules are simpler, more reliable, and more stable than ones that allow for exceptions, so it makes sense for a just legal system to embody such rules and for people to support them. However, I maintain, this means only that people should support the provision of compensation for actual harms resulting from the violation of such rules, not that they should favor, for instance, legal principles that would allow the use of unlimited physical violence to protect the interests delineated by the rules. Also, while the principle of fairness gives everyone significant reason to support the maintenance of the baseline rules, this does not mean that the principle itself will not sometimes warrant violation of the possessory interests. That's because fairness is finally a characteristic of individual choices. When you're implementing or supporting a rule that's going to be applied across a range of cases, it makes sense to think of the rule as a general rule. But when you're deciding for yourself in a particular case, while you still need to think of the impact of your choice on, for instance, general confidence that just possessory interests will be respected, you have to ask what's fair for you to do in that case. So it will make sense for someone simultaneously to A. Support a rule that requires compensation for damage done while trespassing or breaking and entering without exceptions, and B. Break into an abandoned mountain cabin to escape an avalanche. Does that mean that it's consistent with the principle of fairness for people to violate others' just possessory interests with impunity as long as they're willing to pay compensation when they've caused actual harm? Not quite, since there will be, as I've suggested, reason for someone contemplating a possible violation to recognize that the action in which she is deciding to engage might be unreasonable because it would tend to undermine confidence in the reliability of just possessory claims, something everyone has reason to favor. This won't always be the case, but it certainly will on occasion. People will also have further reasons to avoid interfering with others' possessions willy-nilly. For one thing, just compensation for interfering with someone's possessions won't just amount to the value of harm resulting from the interference. It will also include the reasonable costs of recovery, the costs of identifying the person responsible for the interference and securing compensation from her. And responsibility for those costs will certainly serve as a disincentive. In addition, people who take or damage or trespass unjustly won't be viewed very kindly by others. They're likely to be subjected to various kinds of social sanctions over and above the demand that they compensate their victims. Together with a range of plausible generalizations about human behavior and human preferences, the principle of fairness can ground a set of simple, reliable rules about justice in possession, the baseline possessory rules. The principle doesn't resolve all questions about possession, and it's compatible with multiple legal frameworks, but it does constrain quite significantly what will count as a reasonable legal rule regarding possession, and also, if somewhat less severely, what will count as a reasonable choice to interfere with someone else's justly acquired possessions. Among other things, taking the rules seriously will mean avoiding the interference with others' possessions that seems to be the defining characteristic of the predatory state. The Libertarian Case Against Intellectual Property Rights. Roderick T. Long, 1995. It would be interesting to discover how far a seriously critical view of the benefits to society of the law of copyright would have a chance of being publicly stated in a society in which the channels of expression are so largely controlled by people who have a vested interest in the existing situation. Friedrich A. Hayek, The Intellectuals and Socialism. A dispute among libertarians. The status of intellectual property rights, copyrights, patents, and the like, is an issue that has long divided libertarians. Such libertarian luminaries as Herbert Spencer, Lysander Spooner, and Ayn Rand have been strong supporters of intellectual property rights. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was ambivalent on the issue, while radical libertarians like Benjamin Tucker in the last century and Tom Palmer in the present one have rejected intellectual property rights altogether. When libertarians of the first sort come across a purported intellectual property right, they see one more instance of an individual's rightful claim to the product of his labor. When libertarians of the second sort come across a purported intellectual property right, they see one more instance of undeserved monopoly privilege granted by government. I used to be in the first group. Now I am in the second. I'd like to explain why I think intellectual property rights are unjustified, and how the legitimate ends currently sought through the expedient of intellectual property rights might be secured by other, voluntary means. The historical argument. Intellectual property rights have a tainted past. Originally, both patents and copyrights were grants of monopoly privilege pure and simple. A printing house might be assigned a copyright by royal mandate, meaning that only it was allowed to print books or newspapers in a certain district. There was no presumption that copyright originated with the author. Likewise, those with political pull might be assigned a patent, i.e. an exclusive monopoly over some commodity, regardless of whether they had anything to do with inventing it. Intellectual property rights had their origin in governmental privilege and governmental protectionism, not in any zeal to protect the rights of creators to the fruits of their efforts. And the abolition of patents was one of the rallying cries of the 17th century levelers, arguably the first libertarians. Now, this by itself does not prove that there is anything wrong with intellectual property rights as we know them today. An unsavory past is not a decisive argument against any phenomenon. Many worthwhile and valuable things arose from suspect beginnings. Nietzsche once remarked that there is nothing so marvelous that its past will bear much looking into. But the fact that intellectual property rights originated in state oppression should at least make us pause and be very cautious before embracing them. The ethical argument. Ethically, property rights of any kind have to be justified as extensions of the right of individuals to control their own lives. Thus, any alleged property rights that conflict with this moral basis, like the right to own slaves, are invalidated. In my judgment, intellectual property rights also fail to pass this test. To enforce copyright laws and the like is to prevent people from making peaceful use of the information they possess. If you have acquired the information legitimately, say by buying a book, then on what grounds can you be prevented from using it, reproducing it, trading it? Is this not a violation of the freedom of speech and press? It may be objected that the person who originated the information deserves ownership rights over it. But information is not a concrete thing an individual can control. It is a universal, existing in other people's minds and other people's property, and over these, the originator has no legitimate sovereignty. You cannot own information without owning other people. Suppose I write a poem and you read it and memorize it. By memorizing it, you have in effect created a software duplicate of the poem to be stored in your brain. But clearly I can claim no rights over that copy as long as you remain a free and autonomous individual. That copy in your head is yours and no one else's. But now suppose you proceed to transcribe my poem to make a hard copy of the information stored in your brain. The materials you use, pen and ink, are your own property. The information template which you used, that is, the stored memory of the poem, is also your own property. So how can the hard copy you produce from these materials be anything but yours, to publish, sell, adapt, or otherwise treat as you please? An item of intellectual property is a universal. Unless we are to believe in Platonic forms, universals as such do not exist except insofar as they are realized in their many particular instances. Accordingly, I do not see how anyone can claim to own, say, the text of Atlas Shrugged, unless that amounts to a claim to own every single physical copy of Atlas Shrugged. But the copy of Atlas Shrugged on my bookshelf does not belong to Ayn Rand or to her estate. It belongs to me. I bought it, I paid for it, Rand presumably got royalties from the sale, and I'm sure it wasn't sold without her permission. The moral case against patents is even clearer. A patent is, in effect, a claim of ownership over a law of nature. What if Newton had claimed to own calculus or the law of gravity? Would we have to pay a fee to his estate every time we used one of the principles he discovered? The patent monopoly consists in protecting inventors against competition for a period long enough to extort from the people a reward enormously in excess of the labor measure of their services. In other words, in giving certain people a right of property for a term of years in laws and facts of nature, and the power to exact tribute from others for the use of this natural wealth, which should be open to all. Footnote: Benjamin Tucker, Instead of a Book, by a Man Too Busy to Write One. A fragmentary exposition of philosophical anarchism. New York, Tucker, 1893, page 13. Defenders of patents claim that patent laws protect ownership only of inventions, not of discoveries. Likewise, defenders of copyright claim that copyright laws protect only implementations of ideas, not the ideas themselves. But this distinction is an artificial one. Laws of nature come in varying degrees of generality and specificity. If it is a law of nature that copper conducts electricity, it is no less a law of nature that this much copper, arranged in this configuration with these other materials arranged so, makes a workable battery, and so on. Suppose you are trapped at the bottom of a ravine. Saber-toothed tigers are approaching hungrily. Your only hope is to quickly construct a levitation device I've recently invented. You know how it works because you attended a public lecture I gave on the topic, and it's easy to construct quite rapidly out of materials you see lying around in the ravine. But there's a problem. I've patented my levitation device. I own it, not just the individual model I built, but the universal. Thus, you can't construct your means of escape without using my property. And I, mean old skinflint that I am, refuse to give my permission, and so the tigers dine well. This highlights the moral problem with the notion of intellectual property. By claiming a patent on my levitation device, I'm saying that you are not permitted to use your own knowledge to further your ends. By what right? Another problem with patents is that, when it comes to laws of nature, even fairly specific ones, the odds are quite good that two people, working independently but drawing on the same background of research, may come up with the same invention, discovery, independently. Yet patent law will arbitrarily grant exclusive rights to the inventor who reaches the patent office first. The second inventor, despite having developed the idea on his own, will be forbidden to market his invention. Ayn Rand attempts to rebut this objection. As an objection to the patent laws, some people cite the fact that two inventors may work independently for years on the same invention, but one will beat the other to the patent office by an hour or a day and will acquire an exclusive monopoly, while the loser's work will then be totally wasted. This type of objection is based on the error of equating the potential with the actual. The fact that a man might have been the first does not alter the fact that he wasn't. Since the issue is one of commercial rights, the loser in a case of that kind has to accept the fact that in seeking to trade with others, he must face the possibility of a competitor winning the race, which is true of all types of competition. Footnote: Ayn Rand, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. New York, NAL, 1967, page 133, But this reply will not do. Rand is suggesting that the competition to get to the patent office first is like any other kind of commercial competition. For example, suppose you and I are competing for the same job, and you happen to get hired simply because you got to the employer before I did. In that case, the fact that I might have gotten there first does not give me any rightful claim to the job, but that is because I have no right to the job in the first place, and once you get the job, your rightful claim to that job depends solely on the fact that your employer chose to hire you. In the case of patents, however, the story is supposed to be different. The basis of an inventor's claim to a patent on X is supposedly the fact that he has invented X. Otherwise, why not offer patent rights over X to anyone who stumbles into the patent office, regardless of whether they've ever even heard of X? Registering one's invention with the patent office is supposed to record one's right, not to create it. Hence, it follows that the person who arrives at the patent office second has just as much right as the one who arrived first, and this is surely a reductio ad absurdum of the whole notion of patents. The economic argument. The economic case for ordinary property rights depends on scarcity, but information is not, technically speaking, a scarce resource in the requisite sense. If A uses some material resource, that makes less of the resource for B, so we need some legal mechanism for determining who gets to use what when. But information is not like that. When A acquires information, that does not decrease B's share, so property rights are not needed. Some will say that such rights are needed in order to give artists and inventors the financial incentive to create, but most of the great innovators in history operated without benefit of copyright laws. Indeed, sufficiently stringent copyright laws would have made their achievements impossible. Great playwrights like Euripides and Shakespeare never wrote an original plot in their lives. Their masterpieces are all adaptations and improvements of stories written by others. Many of our greatest composers, like Bach, Tchaikovsky, and Ives, incorporated into their work the compositions of others. Such appropriation has long been an integral part of legitimate artistic freedom. Is it credible that authors will not be motivated to write unless they are given copyright protection? Not very. Consider the hundreds of thousands of articles uploaded onto the internet by their authors every day, available to anyone in the world for free. Is it credible that publishers will not bother to publish uncopyrighted works for fear that a rival publisher will break in and ruin their monopoly? Not very. Nearly all works written before 1900 are in the public domain, yet pre-1900 works are still published and still sell. Is it credible that authors in a world without copyrights will be deprived of remuneration for their work? Again, not likely. In the 19th century, British authors had no copyright protection under American law, yet they received royalties from American publishers nonetheless. In his autobiography, Herbert Spencer tells a story that is supposed to illustrate the need for intellectual property rights. Spencer had invented a new kind of hospital bed. Out of philanthropic motives, he decided to make his invention a gift to mankind rather than claiming a patent on it. To his dismay, this generous plan backfired. No company was willing to manufacture the bed because in the absence of a guaranteed monopoly, they found it too risky to invest money in any project that might be undercut by competition. Doesn't this show the need for patent laws? I don't think so. To begin with, Spencer's case seems overstated. After all, companies are constantly producing items, beds, chairs, etc., to which no one holds any exclusive patent. But never mind, let's grant Spencer's story without quibbling. What does it prove? Recall that the companies who rejected Spencer's bed in favor of other uses for their capital were choosing between producing a commodity in which they would have a monopoly and producing a commodity in which they would not have a monopoly. Faced with that choice, they went for the patented commodity as the less risky option, especially in light of the fact that they had to compete with other companies likewise holding monopolies. So the existence of patent laws, like any other form of protectionist legislation, gives the patented commodity an unfair competitive advantage against its unpatented rival. The situation Spencer describes, then, is simply an artifact of the patent laws themselves. In a society without patent laws, Spencer's philanthropic bed would have been at no disadvantage in comparison with other products. The information-based argument. Though never justified, copyright laws have probably not done too much damage to society so far, but in the computer age, they are now becoming increasingly costly shackles on human progress. Consider, for instance, Project Gutenberg, a marvelous nonprofit volunteer effort to transfer as many books as possible to electronic format and make them available over the internet for free. Unfortunately, most of the works done to date have been pre-20th century to avoid the hassles of copyright law. Thus, copyright laws today are working to restrict the availability of information, not to promote it. And Congress, at the behest of the publishing and recording industries, is currently acting to extend copyright protection to last nearly a century after the creator's death, thus ensuring that only a tiny fraction of the information in existence will be publicly available. More importantly, modern electronic communications are simply beginning to make copyright laws unenforceable, or at least unenforceable by any means short of a government takeover of the internet, and such a chilling threat to the future of humankind would clearly be a cure far worse than the disease. Copyright laws in a world where any individual can simultaneously make thousands of copies of a document and send them out all over the planet are as obsolete as laws against voyeurs and peeping toms would be in a world where everyone had X-ray vision. First, Tolkien's story. Here's a story that illustrates some of the needless irritation that intellectual property laws can cause. Several years ago, the avant-garde film animator Ralph Bakshi decided to make a movie of J.R.R. Tolkien's classic fantasy trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. Or rather, he decided to split the trilogy into 2 movies, since the work is really too long to fit easily into a single film. So Bakshi started off with Lord of the Rings Part 1. This movie covered the first volume of the trilogy and part of the second volume. The second movie was to have covered the rest of the second volume, and then the whole of the third volume. To make the first movie, then, Bakshi needed to buy the rights to the first 2 volumes, and this is what he, or presumably his studio, did. But Bakshi never got around to making the second movie, probably because the first movie turned out to be less successful financially than had been anticipated. Enter Rankin Bass, another studio. Rankin Bass had made an animated TV movie of Tolkien's earlier novel The Hobbit, and they were interested in doing the same for the second part of Lord of the Rings left unfilmed by Bakshi. But there was a problem. Bakshi's studio had the rights to the first 2 volumes of the trilogy. Only the rights to the third volume were available. So Rankin Bass's sequel, released as The Return of the King, ended up of necessity covering only the third volume. Those events from the second volume that Bakshi had left unfilmed were simply lost. Not even flashbacks to events in the first 2 volumes were permitted, although flashbacks to The Hobbit were okay because Rankin Bass had the rights to that. Video catalogs now sell The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Return of the King as a unified package, but viewers unfamiliar with the books will be a bit puzzled. In the Bakshi film, the evil wizard Saruman is a looming force to be reckoned with. In the Rankin Bass sequel, he is not even mentioned. Likewise, at the end of the Bakshi film, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum are traveling together. At the beginning of the Rankin Bass sequel, we find them split up without explanation. The answers lie in the unfilmed portion of the second volume, which deals with Saruman's defeat, Gollum's betrayal of Frodo, Sam's battle with Shelob, and Frodo's capture by the orcs. Not unimportant events, these, but thanks to intellectual property laws, the viewer is not allowed to know about them. Is this a catastrophe? I suppose not. The aesthetic unity and continuity of a work of art was mangled pursuant to the requirements of law, but it was just an animated TV movie. So what? So what, perhaps, but my story does serve to cast doubt on the idea that copyright is a bulwark of artistic expression. When a work of art involves reworking material created by others, as most art historically has, copyright laws can place it in a straitjacket. Alternatives to intellectual property rights. Some formulations. I may have given the impression thus far that intellectual property rights serve no useful function whatever. That is not my position. I think some of the ends to which copyrights and patents have been offered as the means are perfectly legitimate. I believe, however, that those ends would be better served by other means. Suppose I pirate your work, put my name on it, and market it as mine. Or suppose I revise your work without your permission and market it as yours. Have I done nothing wrong? On the contrary, I have definitely committed a rights violation. The rights I have violated, however, are not yours but those of my customers. By selling one person's work as though it were the work of another, I am defrauding those who purchase the work, as surely as I would be if I sold soy steaks as beef steaks or vice versa. All you need to do is buy a copy so you can claim to be a customer, and then bring a class action suit against me. There are other legal options available to the creators of intellectual products. For example, many software manufacturers can and do place copy protection safeguards on their programs, or require purchasers to sign contracts agreeing not to resell the software. Likewise, pay TV satellite broadcasters scramble their signal and then sell descramblers. None of these techniques is foolproof, of course. A sufficiently ingenious pirater can usually figure out how to get around copy protections or descramble a signal. And conditional sale contracts place no restriction on third-party users who come by the software in some other way. Still, by making it more difficult to pirate their intellectual products, such companies do manage to decrease the total amount of piracy, and they do stay in business and make profits. But what if I do go ahead and market your work without your permission and without offering you any share of the profits? Is there nothing wrong with this? Can nothing be done about this? In the case described, I don't think what I've done is unjust. That is, it's not a violation of anyone's rights, but it's tacky. Violating someone's rights is not the only way someone can do something wrong. Justice is not the only virtue. But justice is the only virtue that can be legitimately enforced. If I profit from pirating your work, you have a legitimate moral claim against me, but that claim is not a right. Thus, it cannot legitimately use coercion to secure compliance, but that doesn't mean it can't be enforced through other, voluntary methods. A good deal of protection for the creators of intellectual products may be achieved through voluntary compliance alone. Consider the phenomenon of shareware, in which creators of software provide their products free to all comers, but with the request that those who find the program useful send along a nominal fee to the author. Presumably, only a small percentage of shareware users ever pay up. Still, that percentage must be large enough to keep the shareware phenomenon going. There are more organized and effective ways of securing voluntary compliance, however. I have in mind the strategy of boycotting those who fail to respect the legitimate claims of the producers. Research conducted by libertarian scholar Tom Palmer has turned up numerous successful instances of such organized boycotts. In the 1930s, for example, the Guild of Fashion Originators managed to protect dress styles and the like from piracy by other designers, without any help from the coercive power of government. A voluntary boycott is actually a much safer tool than government for protecting the claims of intellectual producers, because in the course of trying to strike a pragmatic balance between the economic power of producers and the economic power of consumers, a private effort is more likely than a government monopoly freed from market incentives to strike an analogous balance between the legitimate moral claims of two groups, the producer's moral claim to remuneration and the consumer's moral claim to easily accessible information. Something more formal can easily be imagined. In the late Middle Ages, a voluntary court system was created by merchants frustrated with the inadequacies of governmentally provided commercial law. This system, known as the law merchant, law being the noun and merchant being the adjective, enforced its decisions solely by means of boycott, and yet it was enormously effective. Suppose producers of intellectual products, authors, artists, inventors, software designers, etc., were to set up an analogous court system for protecting copyrights and patent rights, or rather copy claims and patent claims, since the moral claims in question, though often legitimate, are not rights in the libertarian sense. Individuals and organizations accused of piracy would have a chance to plead their case at a voluntary court, but if found guilty, they would be required to cease and desist and to compensate the victims of their piracy on pain of boycott. What if this system went too far and began restricting the free flow of information in the same undesirable ways that I've argued intellectual property laws do? This is certainly a possibility, but I think the danger is much greater with coercive enforcement than with voluntary enforcement. As Rich Hammer likes to point out, ostracism gets its power from reality, and its power is limited by reality. As a boycotting effort increases in scope, the number and intensity of frustrated desires on the part of those who are being deprived by the boycott of something they want will become greater. As this happens, there will also be a corresponding increase in the number of people who judge that the benefits of meeting those desires, and charging a hefty fee to do so, outweigh the costs of violating the boycott. Too strenuous and restrictive a defense of copy claims will founder on the rock of consumer preferences. Too lax a defense will founder on the rock of producer preferences. Second Tolkien story. Let me close with a second story about Tolkien and his famous trilogy. The first edition of Lord of the Rings to be published in the United States was a pirated edition from Ace Books. For reasons which I now forget, Tolkien could not take legal action against Ace. But when Ballantine came out with its own official author-approved American edition of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien started a campaign against the Ace edition. The Ballantine edition was released with a notice from Tolkien in a green box on the back cover, stating that this was the only authorized edition, and urging any reader with respect for living authors to purchase no other. Moreover, every time he answered a fan letter from an American reader, Tolkien appended a footnote explaining the situation and requesting that the recipient spread the word among Tolkien fans that the Ace edition should be boycotted. Although the Ace edition was cheaper than the Ballantine, it quickly lost readers and went out of print. The boycott was successful. It might be objected that Tolkien devotees tend to be more fanatical than the average readers, and so such a strategy of boycott could not be expected to succeed in ensuring such loyalty generally. True enough, but on the other hand, Tolkien's boycott was entirely unorganized. It simply consisted of a then obscure British professor of medieval language and literature scribbling handwritten responses to fan letters. Think how effective an organized boycott might have been.